Welcome to our Sunday School Bible Study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, December the 17th. It's our third lesson in this unit of study entitled, I Am With You Always. Our lesson this week is entitled, People Are Restored. And in giving Peter the opportunity to confess his love 3 times, Jesus demonstrated his forgiveness and his desire to restore fellowship with his own. Last week we were in the 20th chapter of John, and you might reasonably think that that was the final chapter in the Gospel of John, because in the last couple of verses in chapter 20, John states his purpose for writing the Gospel. Verses 30 and 31, he says, Truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So that sounds like it's a summation. It's the end of the gospel. And some scholars think that John wrote chapter 21 at a later date. Whether he did or not, there seems to be 2 or 3 distinct purposes in his writing chapter 21. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary, suggests 3 reasons that John felt compelled to write chapter 21. And he says the main reason is the Apostle Peter, John's close associate in ministry. John did not want to end his gospel without telling his readers that Peter was restored to his apostleship. And that's a key part of today's lesson. He also says John had another purpose in mind. He wanted to refute the rumor that had spread among the believers that John would live until the return of Jesus. John made it clear that our Lord's words had been greatly misunderstood. That comes at the very end of chapter 21. He then says that he thinks John may have had another purpose in mind. He wanted to teach us how to relate to the risen Christ. During the 40 days between his resurrection and ascension, Jesus appeared and disappeared at will, visiting with the disciples, preparing them for the coming of the Spirit and their future ministries. They never knew when he would appear, so they had to stay alert. And as an aside, he says the fact that he may return for his people today ought to keep us on our toes. It was an important time for the disciples because they were about to take his place in the world and begin to carry the message to others. And we'll see that in today's lesson as well. So let's kind of set the scene and get a picture here of these 11 disciples waiting on Jesus. You remember Jesus had told them that after he had been resurrected, he would meet them in Galilee. The angel had instructed the women at the empty tomb to remind the disciples of this. And Jesus himself had also told the women to tell the disciples again. And so now they've traveled back to Galilee. And even though Jesus had already revealed himself to them twice in the upper room, they're not exactly sure what's coming next here. What did the resurrection mean for them? How would it change them? And as we'll see today, before Jesus could lay out his plans for taking the gospel to the ends of the earth, first there were some relationships that needed to be restored. So, we are going to look at the first 19 verses in John chapter 21. First point is in verses 1 through 6. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and in this way he showed himself. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. And they said to him, we're going with you also. And they went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the morning had come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And then Jesus said to them, children, have you any food? And they answered him, no. And he said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. After these things, some of your translations may say afterward. That implies an indefinite period of time, but not always a long time. And we know that in this case, it's sometime between 8 days after his resurrection, because as we saw last week, that was when he appeared to Thomas and the other disciples in the upper room, and his ascension, which was 40 days after his resurrection. So it's sometime in that roughly month period there. And John tells us that he showed himself again to his disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. That's the Sea of Galilee. You also see it in Scripture referred to as the Lake of Tiberias, the Lake of Gennesaret, the Sea of Chinnereth, all of those names. John is the only New Testament writer that consistently uses the name Sea of Tiberias. So just be aware that he's talking about the Sea of Galilee there. And verse 2 tells us there were 7 disciples that were there that particular morning on the Sea of Galilee. Simon Peter was there. Thomas, the twin, Thomas Didymus, as we saw in last week's lesson. Nathanael, James and John, who are the sons of Zebedee, and then 2 others that are unnamed. So there's 7 of them. And Simon Peter, it seems like, kind of spontaneously said, I'm going fishing. And the others said, well, you're not going by yourself. We'll go with you. And so they went out and got in a boat, and that night they didn't catch anything. There's a lot of debate between Bible scholars as to the appropriateness of their going fishing. Were they being obedient or disobedient in going fishing? Some commentators take the viewpoint that they were going back to their pre-Jesus lives here, becoming again who they once were. Others see it as more they're just waiting, doing something comfortable as they pass the time. They're engaging in something that's familiar to them. So they would take some comfort in that. The Life Application Bible Commentary says Jesus never criticized his disciples for going fishing. Whatever their motives, fishing was a familiar activity that gave them a sense of normalcy and comfort. It gave them something to do and time to sort out their thoughts. But their efforts yielded nothing. Many times our efforts at work, parenting, ministry, whatever we're engaged in, leave us with just empty nets, metaphorically. The Lord allows us to experience lack of productivity, frustrations, failure, to bring us closer to Him and to help us rely on Him, not on our own resourcefulness. When you feel tired and empty, listen for Jesus' words to you. Because as we read on, when the morning had come, Jesus himself was standing on the shore. He just appeared there on the shore, it seems. And the disciples didn't recognize him. Once again, they failed to recognize Jesus. Perhaps the light wasn't very good. Perhaps they were preoccupied with their fishing. For sure, they weren't expecting to see him. And so all of those may have played into that. Again, the Life Application Bible Commentary poses the question, are you involved in some area or activity where you think a visit from Jesus would be unlikely? Guard against being so preoccupied with your own work that you miss seeing Christ. Expect that he can do the miraculous in ordinary events. Look for him throughout each day. So as they're fishing, they haven't caught anything. Jesus calls out to them, and he calls them children. He says, have you any food or have you caught anything? And they answered no, still not realizing that it's Jesus. And so then he tells them, cast the net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. Now that calls to mind the events that are recorded by Luke in Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, where Peter and some other disciples were fishing and didn't catch anything, and Jesus told them to go out into the deeper water. And Peter, being an experienced fisherman, knew that didn't make any sense, so he's doubtful about that, but he did it. And when they obeyed, a miracle occurred. And you remember when that first miracle occurred, Peter fell at Jesus' knees saying, get away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. So here again we see Peter as a central character here, and Jesus again makes a what probably seemed to these experienced fishermen a kind of a foolish request of them. Cast your nets on the right side of the boat. But they were obedient. They did that. So they cast, and immediately they got results. They got miraculous results. They were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. So, very familiar kind of setting here. Let's move to point 2, verses 7 through 14. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. And as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish which you have just caught. So Simon Peter went and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. Jesus said to them, come and eat breakfast. Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? Knowing that it was the Lord. And Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. This is now the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So it was John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and that's the way that John often described himself in the gospel that he wrote. It may have been to identify himself as an apostle, but it also may have been to emphasize that he understood that his ultimate identity was one who was loved by Jesus Christ. So John was part of that group in the first miracle when Jesus told them to go out into deeper water and fish in Luke 5. And so he's the one that puts it all together and recognizes Jesus. And he says to Peter, "It's the Lord." And when Peter heard that, his response shouldn't surprise us because it's pretty impulsive here. He's always been the impulsive one, the one to act, to speak, to react, whether it's climbing out of the boat to walk on the water, offering to build shelters on the Mount of Transfiguration, refusing to let Jesus wash his feet, cutting off Malchus' ear with his sword when Jesus was arrested, or denying Jesus. So here he jumps in the lake to swim to Jesus. So it's hard to know exactly what prompted him to do this. Perhaps he's still feeling the awkwardness between them, the barrier because of his denial. But his impulsiveness is such a part of his character that he just jumps in the water and swims to shore. Now, John doesn't tell us what he did when he got to shore, so we have to kind of use our imagination there. We got out of the water dripping wet, and now he's facing Jesus, the one that he had denied. Perhaps he's at a loss for words. One can imagine that Jesus appreciated the fire that Jesus had burning, and perhaps he stood by the fire there and dried off. At the same time, that probably stirred memories of a previous time when he had stood by the fire and he had been confronted by someone who said, "You knew Jesus," and he denied knowing him. So, if any words were exchanged between him and Jesus here, they were between the two of them. We're not privy to those since everyone was still out in the boat. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net with the fish. And when they got there, they saw that Jesus had this fire going, and he had cooked fish and bread. The Life Application Commentary says, what a welcome pleasure for the senses to find a warm fire, a hot meal, and the greatest friend of all waiting for them after a frustrating night and an exhausting conclusion to their fishing expedition. Tired, hungry, and frustrated, these discouraged disciples needed a lift. They lacked direction. They were uncertain of the Lord's presence and help. Jesus came to them, made his presence known, and gave them direction. Are you discouraged in your work for the Lord? Jesus is prepared for you. He has a gracious welcome waiting. He offered the disciples a warm fire and breakfast. He also wants to give us sustenance, comfort, and fellowship. Well, Jesus spoke to them, said, bring some of the fish that you've just caught. And so Peter's the one that went and dragged the net to land full of these large fish. And John tells us in verse 11 that there were 153 of this fish. And although they were so many, the net was not broken. The 153 fish, large fish as he describes, in the wet net must have weighed a considerable amount, several hundred pounds perhaps. And it's really interesting that John records for us the exact number. There were 153. That has given rise to a lot of different speculations about the significance of the fact that there were 153 fish. A lot of Bible scholars feel like that it doesn't have any other significance other than it was a large amount of fish that they caught after having caught nothing during the night. And that exact number is recorded just as a matter of historical fish, because it was a practice in that time for a group of fishermen to count the day's catch and divide it among themselves. The expositor's commentary says the observation of the exact number of fish and the fact that the net didn't break reflect both an eyewitness account and a fisherman's perspective. John was impressed by the numerical size of the catch and the preservation of the net under the stress. In Judaism, an abundant catch was a sign of God's favor and blessing. And that's precisely what Jesus has done here. He blesses them further by greeting them with a fire and roasting fish together with fresh bread, which was a typical first century meal in Galilee. So others have, down through the centuries, have attached a greater significance to that 153. Greek and Hebrew letters had numerical values. And this system became a code for symbolic meanings. And so some have sought a numerical value in the 153. For example, the Greek words Simon and fish with those numerical values totals 153. In 1958, there was a suggestion made that pointed to Ezekiel chapter 47, verses 9 and 10, where it says, "At the end of time, a stream will flow from Jerusalem filled with fish from En-gedi to En-eglaim." And I may be mispronouncing both of those. En-gedi is 17 with the numerical values, and En-eglaim is 153. The number 17 is significant because it's the triangular number of 153. If you take all the digits, 1, 2, 3, up through 17, and add them together, you get 153, I'm told. I didn't do that, but that's what I read. And ancient mathematicians and scholars studied these sequences. And so that gives rise to all kinds of different speculations. For instance, Augustine noted the number 17 and thought of 153 believers who were inspired by the 7 gifts of the Spirit to obey the 10 commandments. So you got 153 and 17 again. Well, the Believer's Bible Commentary kind of sums all of this up. Many interesting explanations have been offered as to the meaning of this number, the number of languages in the world at the time, the number of races or tribes in the world toward which the gospel net would be spread out, the number of different kinds of fish in the Sea of Galilee or even in the world. The truth is, if John had a symbolic meaning in mind, we can only guess what it is. But it represents, certainly it represents, extreme abundance and blessing from the one who controls good gifts from heaven. Jesus said to the disciples, "Come and eat breakfast." And the disciples, it seems like it's kind of awkward and tense. They felt this sense of awe and kind of a solemnity in the presence of Jesus because there he stands in front of them. And there were so many questions that they would like to have asked him, but they didn't dare. They knew it was the Lord, even as they felt this sense of mystery shrouding his person. And so Jesus came and took the bread, gave it to them, and likewise the fish. Warren Wiersbe in his commentary says how loving of Jesus to feed Peter before he dealt with his spiritual needs. He gave Peter opportunity to dry off, get warm, satisfy his hunger, and enjoy personal fellowship. This is a good example for us to follow as we care for God's people. Certainly the spiritual is more important than the physical, but caring for the physical can prepare the way for spiritual ministry. Our Lord does not so emphasize the soul that he neglects the body. And then verse 14, John records that this is now the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. In the last 3 weeks, we've studied those three events. In the resurrection morning, he appeared to the disciples in the upper room. Then 8 days later, he appeared to the disciples with Thomas present this time, as we studied last week. So that's a very interesting story up to this point, the fishing and the miracles there that occur with the fishing. But as we move to the final 5 verses here of our lesson this week, John 21, verses 15 through 19, we're going to see the crux of the matter here as Jesus deals with his relationship with Peter. Verses starting in verse 15. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? He said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, Feed my lambs. And he said to him again a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And he said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, Tend my sheep. And he said to him the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, Do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, Feed my sheep. Most assuredly, I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you'll stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. And this he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, Follow me. So after they've eaten, the first thing Jesus says to Peter, and he addresses Simon Peter directly, do you love me more than these? That question to Peter can be translated in 3 different ways. Do you love me more than these other men love me? Do you love me more than you love these men? Or do you love me more than these things, the boat, the nets, and all of the things that were involved with the fishing? Most of the commentaries that I read agree that the first option there is the most appropriate, because Peter had boasted that he would never forsake Jesus, even if all the other disciples did. Peter had boasted of his love for Christ, and he had contrasted his love with the love of the others. I will lay down my life for your sake, he says in John 13:37. Though all men shall be offended because of thee, yet I will never be offended, he says in Matthew 26:33. So there's more than a hint in these boastful statements that Peter believed that he loved Jesus more than the other disciples did. And so he responds to Jesus, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus says to him, Feed my lambs. And Jesus repeats the question to him. The second time he just says to him, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And he gets the same answer from Peter. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And this time he says to him, tend my sheep. And Jesus says to him the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said that the third time. He's kind of insulted by that, it seems. And again, he says to Jesus, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And this time Jesus says, feed my sheep. Now you'll notice that Jesus gives him 3 opportunities here to confess his love to him. And perhaps it's significant that he has said to Peter that you'll deny me 3 times. And Peter did deny him 3 times. And now he has 3 opportunities to confess him. Many commentaries point out that in this conversation, there are 2 different words for love used. And in his questions in verses 15 and 16, Jesus used agape. Do you agape me? Do you love me? With that self-sacrificial love, that word that Greek word that the Christians adopted to describe the sacrificial love that Jesus demonstrated for us. Peter responds, yes, Lord, I phileo you. I'm fond of you. I have affection for you. That's brotherly love. Philadelphia comes from that word, the city of brotherly love here. And then in verse 17, Jesus uses that, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Do you phileo me? And Peter responds again with that same word. Now, scholars are divided about the significance of that because John, in his writing, he seems to use those 2 words kind of interchangeably here. In John 3:16, God's love for man is agape. But in John 16:27, for the Father himself loves you dearly because you love me and believe that I come from God, John uses phileo there. The Father's love for his Son is agape love. In John 3:35, the Father loves his Son and has put everything into his hands. But in John 5:20, it's phileo. For the Father loves the Son and shows him everything he is doing. Christians are supposed to love one another. In John 13:34, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another. That's agape. But in John 15:19, the world would love you as one of its own if you belong to it. It's phileo love. So John uses them interchangeably. Also, we need to keep in mind, they were probably speaking Aramaic, but this is written in Greek. So it's probably easy to make too much of that. But there's a good case to be made for a difference in Jesus' emphasis. Certainly there was less doubt concerning Peter's affection for Jesus, his attachment to Jesus, his phileo love, than there was concerning his will to love at all cost, the agape love. And the change in term in verse 17, the third question, makes his probing of Peter even deeper. If we interpret the use of different words as significant, it helps to explain Peter's distress when questioned the third time, since Jesus not only challenges his love, but implies that it's a bit superficial. So, it's hard to tell. But, however you interpret that, don't miss Jesus' instruction to Peter. What he said those 3 times when he asked Peter if he loved him. And when Peter answered yes, Jesus told him, feed his sheep. It's one thing for us to say we love Jesus, but the real test requires actually doing it. Peter had repented. Here Jesus was asking him to commit his life. Peter's life changed when he finally realized who Jesus was. His occupation changed from fisherman to evangelist. His identity changed from impetuous to rock solid. And his relationship to Jesus changed from one who had denied him to one who was forgiven. And Peter finally understood the significance of Jesus' words about his death and resurrection. John here closes his gospel with a second summary statement. The one in last week's lesson at the end of chapter 20 focused on the reason for the book. This one highlights John's awareness that all he has written about Jesus was just a glimpse of what Jesus had said and done. At the end of chapter 21, John says there were also many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. In those 3 questions that Peter asked, that Jesus asked Peter, he gave 3 admonitions to Peter. Feed my lambs, shepherd my sheep, and feed my sheep. So there's some fine distinctions there. Feed or pasture my lambs. Take care of or shepherd my sheep. Feed or pasture my sheep. The first and the third there talk about taking the sheep to pasture where they're fed. The second, the shepherding, there implies the total guardianship that a shepherd assumes. So it's a very important admonition that Jesus gives to Peter. The challenge to Peter here demanded a total renewal of his loyalty, and it reaffirmed his responsibility. Peter never forgot that. We read in 1 Peter 5, verse 2, shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly, not as being worthy lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. So there are enemies that want to destroy the flock, and the shepherd has to be alert and courageous. We know that by nature sheep are ignorant, they're defenseless, and they need the protection and guidance of a shepherd. Jesus helped Peter to grasp this valuable life lesson. He must learn humility before he could obtain leadership. Peter needed to confront realistically his shortcomings before he could guide the flock. The strong, powerful personality of Peter had to be broken before he could deal compassionately with others. And we see that come through. In verses 18 and 19, Jesus says, I tell you the truth. And that introductory phrase there makes it helps us to understand that what Jesus is going to say here is solemn and important. And so he goes on to explain Jesus' kind of enigmatic words there. I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wish, but when you're old, you'll stretch out your hand and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. And then Jesus explains that he spoke signifying the death of Peter, how it would glorify God here. That probably was a shock to Peter, to have the Lord discuss his death in such an open manner. We can imagine that Peter here is feeling a sense of relief and rejoicing that he's been restored to fellowship. Why bring up the martyrdom here? But it was important for Peter to understand the total picture there. When a person has settled the matter of death, then he's ready to live and to serve. And Jesus' own death is a repeated theme in John's gospel. He knew that his hour had come, and he yielded himself to be that living sacrifice. Earlier that morning, Peter had girded himself and hurried to shore to meet Jesus. The day would come when another would take charge of Peter and kill him. So Peter, from that day forward, knew what lay before him. And he never forgot Jesus' prophecy there either. In 2 Peter 1:14, for our Lord Jesus Christ has shown me that I must soon leave this earthly life. Tradition tells us that Peter was indeed crucified, but he asked to be crucified upside down because he wasn't worthy to die exactly as his master had died. The last thing Jesus said to him, follow me. When he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. So by his words there, Jesus was reinstating, restoring Peter as his disciple. What assurance these words must have been for Peter. 3 years earlier, alongside this same lake, Jesus had said those same words to Peter, follow me. Literally, Jesus said, keep on following me. The words are a present tense imperative that means keep on following. Stripped of pride, impulsiveness, false expectations of leadership, Peter's now ready to follow Christ in a new way. Follow me means consistent discipleship, steadfast pursuit of Christ, even to the point of death. It means continuing Christ's work in the way he wants it done, not in the way we want it done. Let me close out with a selection from Max Lucado's Encouraging Word Bible. He says the most difficult journey is back to the place where you failed. Peter is in the boat on the lake, and once again he's fished all night, and once again the sea has surrendered nothing. His thoughts are interrupted by a shout from the shore. Catch any fish? Peter and John look up. Probably a villager. No, they yell. Try the other side, the voice shouts. So out sails the net, and Peter wraps the rope around his wrist to wait. But there is no weight. The rope pulls taut and the net catches. Peter begins to bring in the net, reaching down, pulling up, reaching down, pulling up. He's so intense with the task, he misses the message. But John doesn't. It's the Lord, Peter, it's the Lord. Peter plunges into the water, swims to the shore, stumbles out wet and shivering, and stands in front of the friend he betrayed. Jesus has prepared a bed of coals. Both are aware of the last time that Peter had stood near a fire. Peter had failed God, but God had come to him. For one of the few times in his life, Peter's silent. What words would suffice? The moment's too holy for words. God's offering breakfast to the friend who betrayed him, and Peter is once again finding grace at Galilee. Now it's just you and God. You and God both know what you did, and neither one of you is proud of it. What do you do? you might consider doing what Peter did. Stand in God's presence. Stand in His sight. Stand still and wait. Sometimes that's all a soul can do. Too repentant to speak, but too hopeful to leave. We just stand amazed. He's come back and He invites us to try again, this time with Him. Aren't we glad that Jesus is a God of second chances and He restores us when we have failed? It's a wonderful message in John chapter 21. Next week we won't meet, but New Year's Eve we'll pick back up with the next unit of study, and we'll move into Acts. We'll be in Acts chapter 1. Thank you.